Imagine standing in a room where history itself seems to hold its breath, a place where men of wealth and power cluster, not just to buy or sell, but to measure the worth of human life as if it were a ledger entry. The air is thick with the scent of tobacco, polished wood, and something darker, something unspeakable. It is March 14th, 1857, in Charleston, South Carolina, and a single figure is about to enter a world that will never forget her. But no records of this day speak of her in plain terms. The city archives, meticulous in their cruelty, hide her story behind cut pages and faded ink, as though even history itself feared what she would reveal. She steps onto the auction block, her wrists shackled, yet her presence is commanding, not with the meekness expected of the enslaved, but with a composure so precise, so terrifyingly deliberate, it arrests every gaze. Eyes follow her every motion, but the strange part, the part that will unsettle every man in that room, is not her posture, her youth, or even her silence. It is the knowledge that she carries a secret, a truth so profound that it defies the natural order of this world, so valuable that men will pay fortunes simply to unlock it. They whisper, fearing to speak it aloud, because there is a power here that cannot be bargained with or broken by force. The auctioneer, a veteran of thousands of transactions, falters. His practiced cadence, honed over decades to extract maximum profit, stutters like a child confronted with the impossible. He glances at the escorts, men who appear to have traveled great distances under the weight of a mandate too grave to name. Their faces are stern, unreadable. One slip, one misstep, and even the most seasoned observers will understand this is not a sale, it is a reckoning. And then the murmurs rise, almost involuntarily. A single word escapes one man's lips before he catches himself. Knowledge? The room freezes. Yes, knowledge, but not of trade, not of land or crops. Something far older, far more dangerous. The kind of knowledge that elites guard jealously, that corrupt empires destroy to maintain their dominion. This is the secret that will haunt men for decades, the truth buried in the soil of plantations, hidden in plain sight, waiting for one who dares to claim it. By the time the gavel falls, some men have already begun to shake, though none yet knows why. A single human life, yet the weight of the world seems to balance upon her shoulders. And in that first, frozen moment, every man present understands something instinctively. What happens next is no longer a matter of commerce. It is the unveiling of something forbidden, something dangerous, something that will forever change the rules of power. The crowd does not yet understand what it is they are witnessing, but they feel it, a subtle shift in reality itself. The rhythm of the auction, the certainty of commerce, the rules that have always governed the buying and selling of men and women, all of it has collapsed in an instant, and at the center of this fracture stands a young woman whose calm is unnerving, whose silence screams louder than any voice. Her eyes are not vacant, they are mirrors, reflecting truths that no man is prepared to face. Some will whisper later that she looked straight into their souls, and in that moment, the walls of their pride and certainty crumbled. No ledger can contain her story, no law can justify the price she commands. The numbers that begin to rise, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, are meaningless in comparison to the weight of the secret she embodies. And the men bidding, wealthy merchants, plantation owners, ambitious strangers, do not understand why they are compelled to compete. It is not greed, it is instinct. Deep in the primitive architecture of human power, something older than money has been triggered, the desire to control the unknowable, to claim dominion over forces that cannot be explained, forces that terrify even the most rational mind. She is more than human, yet still human enough to walk, breathe, and remain unbroken. The escorts who brought her here are not soldiers, they are custodians of something older, guardians who understand that the wrong hands could unravel the very fabric of society. Her knowledge, they hint, has been tested, conditioned, and sealed in ways most men would dismiss as legend. Yet the auctioneer reads it aloud. She possesses information that could alter land, claims, commerce, even the balance of power across entire states. And the crowd, though unable to articulate it, feels the danger lurking beneath the polite words and legalese. History has always been selective. It favors the winners, the powerful, the compliant. But in this moment, the ledger has failed, the system has been breached, the rules of control, The hierarchies built upon fear and ignorance falter in the presence of one young woman and the truth she carries. Some men are already beginning to understand that the wealth they hold in their hands, the coins, the land, the enslaved workers, is insignificant compared to the secret that could shift destinies overnight. And yet she speaks not a word. She does not negotiate. She does not plead. She waits, patient, unyielding, as if the men before her are pieces in a game only she understands. Theirs is the illusion of choice. Hers is the certainty of power. By the time the gavel rises to fall, every man in that room has glimpsed the first layer of a reality, deliberately hidden for centuries, a design so intricate that most will spend their lives denying its existence. But denial will not save them. Who was she really? No one in that room could say. No ledger, no local record, no whispered rumor fully captured the truth. She did not arrive as a simple commodity. She emerged from the shadows of a world most men never knew existed, a world carefully erased from official histories, hidden behind layers of secrecy and fear. Some historians later speculated she had been trained, conditioned, even experimented upon, but the truth is far darker. She was a product of design, a living repository of knowledge deliberately extracted, honed, and concealed, her very being crafted to contain information so powerful that it could topple entire hierarchies if released to the wrong hands. The men bidding on her could not comprehend the magnitude of what she represented. To them, she was wealth, potential labor, a curiosity, but she was none of those things. She carried within her the encoded strategies of trade, agriculture, territorial dominance, knowledge verified by sworn witnesses sealed by law and shielded by methods that defied ordinary comprehension. The legal framework meant to control her, papers, signatures, attestations, was nothing more than a thin veil over an extraordinary reality. Every glance, every posture, every subtle gesture had been calibrated to ensure that only the rightful claimant, the one capable of understanding and wielding her knowledge, could unlock it. The room itself seemed to recognize the anomaly. Old walls, polished and familiar, felt suddenly smaller, confining. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the floorboards. The auctioneer, seasoned and composed, fumbled with the script before him, reading aloud words that seemed almost ceremonial. Even the voices in the crowd, the confident merchants, the calculating farmers, the strangers with hidden agendas, wavered under the weight of something they could not see but instinctively feared. Something primal stirred, the knowledge that they were no longer masters of the transaction. Something far older than wealth had claimed dominion over their minds. This young woman, seemingly fragile, had been trained by forces invisible to most of society. Scholars, financiers, and politicians, all players in an unseen game of power, had long worked to suppress knowledge of such human conduits. To them, she was a threat, because she represented a truth beyond obedience, beyond law, beyond the accepted hierarchy of civilization. And yet she remained silent, her lips sealed not by fear, but by purpose. The real terror in that room was not the auction, the price, or the money. It was the undeniable realization that the world, as the men knew it, was already controlled by systems they had never perceived. History is written by survivors, but what survives is always a filtered version of power. And in that moment, March 14, 1857, history itself had paused. It had allowed a glimpse of what lies behind the curtain, a meticulously engineered instrument of influence, of secrecy, of manipulation. One human life, it seemed, was worth more than 100 plantations, more than every ledger, every contract, every moral justification men had built for centuries. They were standing on the threshold of a truth that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and she, silent, composed, unbroken, was its guardian. What you must understand is that her presence on that auction block was not a coincidence. She had been meticulously cultivated by forces operating in the shadows, networks of influence stretching across plantations, mercantile houses, and even political offices. These were men and women who understood the true architecture of power, who knew that the world's systems, law, commerce, religion, were merely facades masking far older, far more insidious structures. They engineered lives like hers not for profit, but for control, to concentrate knowledge in a single, unassailable vessel, someone whose mind and body were instruments, tools of power and manipulation beyond comprehension. Her training had been surgical. She was conditioned to resist ordinary coercion, to mask her thoughts beneath layers of apparent submission, to project an aura that made even the most aggressive men hesitate. Yet beneath the calm, beneath the silence, lurked a profound awareness of human weakness. She could read intentions, detect fear, sense ambition, and exploit it without uttering a word. Every auction house observer, every wealthy bidder, every power-hungry stranger became unwitting participants in a psychological experiment centuries in the making. They had no idea they were being measured, analyzed, and, ultimately, entrapped. The price escalated because of what they could not see, the invisible systems she carried, the maps of influence and opportunity etched into her memory, the knowledge of resources, strategies, and secrets that could reshape states. It was not just wealth. It was dominion, the kind of dominion that leaves men trembling even after they believe they have won. Each bid reflected an unconscious recognition of the stakes, an acknowledgement that failure to claim her could mean the loss of leverage, of advantage, of unseen influence in a world already dominated by forces most men could not perceive. And this is the crucial point. Power is not given. It is extracted, claimed, enforced, and defended. For centuries, elite networks had understood that information is the ultimate currency, more potent than gold, more lethal than armies. And yet the mechanisms by which they controlled it, secret societies, coded contract, TS, selective education, human conduits, were deliberately obscured. Ordinary men, no matter how wealthy, were never meant to penetrate this system. They could only participate at its edges, feeling the pressure, sensing the weight, but never fully grasping the architecture that guided their desires, their fears, and even their impulses. This is why she terrified them. She was not just a woman, she was a repository, a gatekeeper, an embodiment of centuries of hidden human engineering. And in the silence of her gaze, in the unshakable composure of her posture, every man present realized the truth they had always avoided. Control is never visible. It is silent, it is precise. And when wielded correctly, it makes kings, merchants, and men of ambition alike feel powerless in its presence. That is why, long after the gavel fell, her image haunted them. Not because they had purchased her, but because she had already purchased them, mind, fear, and ego alike. To understand why men were willing to pay fortunes for her, you must see what others could not. History is not merely written, it is curated, censored, and weaponized. Every ledger, every newspaper, every official record in Charleston and beyond exists to guide perception, not reveal reality. What this young woman carried was a knowledge deliberately stripped from public memory, buried under layers of law, commerce, and ritualized violence. It was knowledge that could expose networks of corruption, overturn monopolies, and destabilize the very foundations of states and plantations alike. And the men bidding on her, though unaware of the full scope, instinctively recognized the threat of what she represented. Her expertise was not academic, not learned from books or public instruction. It was encoded within her being, passed down, refined, and encrypted by those who understood that ordinary systems of power, courts, contract, TS auctions, were insufficient to protect the truly dangerous truths. She held maps of influence, methods of territorial control, agricultural secrets capable of creating wealth beyond imagination, and insights into human behavior that could manipulate entire communities. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully withheld word was part of a design so deliberate that it had taken generations to perfect. The elite networks that shaped her existence had always operated in the shadows. They understood that control over knowledge is the ultimate form of domination. Institutions, churches, governments, and economic bodies serve only as veneers. Beneath them lie invisible hierarchies where a few men, often nameless in history books, shape events, fortunes, and lives without ever stepping into the light. She was a living instrument of this hidden order, a conduit between the forgotten architects of power and those who sought to claim a piece of it for themselves. And yet, the most terrifying aspect was not what she knew, but what would happen if that knowledge were misused. Those who fail to respect it, who attempt to coerce it, who act out of greed or fear, become vessels of ruin. Entire plantations could collapse, communities could fracture, economic systems could unravel. It was not just information, it was a force, a weapon, a responsibility that most men were ill-equipped to handle. And in Charleston that morning, every bidder was unknowingly flirting with a power that would either elevate or destroy them. This is why the auction transcended ordinary commerce. It was a lesson in hierarchy, in the subtle mechanics of dominance and submission, in the invisible chains that bind human ambition. She was not for sale in any conventional sense. She was a test, a gatekeeper, a reckoning, and every man present, no matter how wealthy or powerful, realized in the quiet moments between bids that they were participating in something far older, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The history books would record only the price, but the truth, the lethal truth, remained buried, waiting for those willing to look beyond the veil. The final bidder, the man who ultimately claimed her, remains an enigma in historical accounts. Some described him as a farmer from the western mountains, roughened by wind and sun, humble in appearance yet utterly unshakable. Others insisted he was a stranger, a shadow among men, his features hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his voice calm as he bid sums that exceeded reason. But appearances were irrelevant. What mattered was that he alone understood the rules of the hidden game, the silent laws of control that governed knowledge beyond commerce, beyond law, beyond fear itself. He was chosen, not by coincidence, but by alignment with forces older than the city, older than the auction block, older even than the concept of wealth. The sealed letter that accompanied the sale was not a formality. It was a codex of power. Within it were instructions for eliciting the knowledge she carried, methods precise, deliberate, and potentially lethal if misapplied. The auctioneer read the document aloud, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror, revealing a legal acknowledgement of the extraordinary measures required to access the information within her mind. Ordinary questioning, intimidation, or coercion would fail. Every instruction had been designed to filter for the mind capable of understanding, interpreting, and deploying the secrets she held. It was an extraction process, yes, but more than that, it was a test of character, insight, and the subtle mastery of influence. The crowd could not comprehend the significance. Men who thought themselves powerful, men who had ruled plantations and markets with iron will, found themselves fumbling, their instincts screaming that they were in the presence of something both human and inhuman. The tension was palpable. Some whispered that the young woman was more than a repository of knowledge. She was a living key to forces suppressed for generations, a bridge between the visible world and the invisible currents of elite power. The room vibrated with fear and fascination alike. The invisible architecture of manipulation had been revealed, if only for a moment, and those who glimpsed it would never look at their lives or their society the same way again. And here lies the most dangerous part. What she carries is not knowledge meant for casual use. Misapplied, it can destroy. Misunderstood, it can corrupt. Only one who recognizes the weight of unseen systems, the networks that control human behavior, commerce, and influence, can unlock her secrets without falling victim to them. The bidders did not understand this, but the universe, cruel and precise, had already judged who was worthy. The farmer, or the stranger, was the chosen, whether by fate, design, or the deliberate orchestration of invisible powers. This is the nature of true power. It is not the loud, obvious dominion of armies or titles. It is silent, precise, and unyielding. And standing at the center of this lesson, the young woman on the auction block remained serene, untouched, and absolute, a reminder that knowledge, once concentrated in the right vessel, surpasses every measure of human ambition. She had already decided the fate of every man in that room, and they did not yet know it. The sealed letter was more than instructions. It was a map of human behavior, a guide to the delicate interplay between power, obedience, and comprehension. It detailed how the knowledge within her could be accessed, but only under exact conditions, emphasizing patience, precision, and subtlety. Any deviation could render the process useless or deadly. Those who had come to the auction expecting dominance over a human life would discover that mastery over her required a mastery far beyond the ordinary, mastery of perception, intuition, and moral discipline. The letter, in essence, was a test disguised as a contract. It challenged not just intellect, but the very fiber of character. Her conditioning was equally profound. Years, Perhaps decades of deliberate training had honed her mind and body into a vessel capable of resisting coercion, interpreting intention, and storing vast and complex systems of knowledge. She could perceive patterns in human behavior that others overlooked, detect hidden hierarchies, and respond to attempts at manipulation with unerring accuracy. Ordinary cruelty, threats, or persuasion had no effect. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle shift in the auction room had been absorbed and catalogued by her consciousness. To confront her without understanding these rules was to walk into a trap designed to expose weakness. Even the most seasoned men in the room, merchants, plantation owners, strangers, felt it. They could not articulate what they sensed, only that a force existed beyond their comprehension. Some experienced a creeping anxiety, a sense that they were being measured, analyzed, and, in a sense, judged. It was not her intent to intimidate. Her role was to protect, to guard the knowledge she carried. And yet, in doing so, she became the architect of psychological upheaval. Men who had considered themselves rational, composed, and in control discovered themselves reacting with irrationality, with desperation, with obsession. The lesson was brutal. Control over knowledge is absolute, and those who attempt it unprepared will fail. The secrecy surrounding her origins, her abilities, and the very nature of the knowledge she carried. Ed speaks to a broader truth. Elite power is rarely visible. It operates through hidden channels, through conditioning, through human conduits meticulously designed to preserve and transmit influence. History's greatest manipulators understood this. True authority resides not in wealth, titles, or armies, but in control over what people do not see, over the systems they cannot measure. She embodied that principle. Every man in that auction house became a participant in a ritual of revelation and submission, whether he realized it or not, and so she remained silent, calm, and unyielding, a living testament to the terrifying potency of hidden knowledge. To possess her legally was one thing. To understand her, to unlock the intelligence she carried, was another. Few would ever rise to that challenge. Many would try, most would fail, and the very few who succeeded would find themselves irrevocably transformed, forever caught in the web of invisible systems that define power and manipulate reality itself. The bidding began as a murmur, a tentative acknowledgement of something extraordinary. $5,000, a number that should have been absurd. But as the sums rose, 6, 8, 10,000, men began to realize that logic, commerce, and reason had abandoned them. They were no longer in control. Their ambition, greed, and fear were being manipulated, each bid pulling them deeper into a psychological labyrinth they did not understand. The room, once orderly, became a theater of tension, anticipation, and unspoken panic. Every heartbeat echoed the impossible, that one human life could hold a value far beyond their comprehension. The higher the bids climbed, the more obvious it became that the crowd was not acting purely out of desire. Invisible forces carefully orchestrated were shaping their behavior. A glance exchanged across the room could trigger a spike in bids. A hesitation by one man could sow doubt and fear in another. The auctioneer, seasoned beyond measure, recognized the anomaly but lacked the tools to counter it. He was witnessing not commerce, but the unfolding of a controlled experiment, one where human psychology was the instrument, and the young woman on the block was both conductor and prize. Some men began to panic. They shouted accusations. "It's madness. She has no skill." Yet the voices of reason faltered against the pull of curiosity and instinctive understanding. Deep in the psyche of every bidder, a primal drive had been activated, the need to claim what cannot be owned, to dominate the unknowable, to assert mastery over forces far beyond their grasp. And yet, the very act of bidding was surrender. Every increment of currency paid was a silent confession. They were subject to systems of influence they did not perceive, pawns dancing on a board designed by unseen architects. The frenzy escalated. $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, the sums shattered precedent, exceeding the combined worth of plantations, livestock, and enslaved workers. Men felt their hearts pound, their judgment clouded, their rational minds unable to resist. And at the center of it all, she remained unmoved, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room, as though the world of panic and obsession unfolding beneath her were a trivial performance. She did not respond to the greed, the fear, or the moral outrage swirling around her. She simply observed, patient, unyielding, and infinitely powerful in her silence. It was in these moments that the invisible truths of control became apparent. Those who understand power, true power, know it is not exercised by brute force or intimidation. It is subtle, it is indirect. It works through perception, conditioning, and the manipulation of human desire. And in the chaos of the auction, the men who believed themselves masters of fortune discovered that they were, in fact, instruments of her presence. The secret she carried, the history she embodied, and the networks that had created her were all converging in this single, impossible moment. By the time the gavel was ready to fall, the lesson was clear. Nothing in this world can be truly possessed without understanding the unseen forces that govern it. As the bidding reached its impossible heights, a slow, creeping horror settled over the room. It was not fear of the price alone. It was the dawning realization that the rules they had lived by, commerce, law, social hierarchy, were illusions. All their wealth, all their supposed control, was meaningless against the force embodied by a single human being. Some men felt it as a physical weight pressing on their chests, a primal anxiety that whispered of vulnerability, of inadequacy, of forces beyond their comprehension. Others felt their minds fray, caught between disbelief and fascination, drawn towards something they could not articulate, something forbidden. Those who tried to assert dominance found themselves floundering, voices raised in protest, accusations hurled at the auctioneer, threats of legal action, all of it dissolved against the quiet authority of her presence. She was a living system of control, an instrument designed to reveal the weaknesses, desires, and impulses of those who confronted her. Every man bidding, every whispering spectator, became part of a study they would never fully understand. Their own greed and ambition were turned against them, amplified, and exposed for what they truly were. Tools for an agenda older than the city itself, older than the plantation economy, older than the law. It was at this point that some began to grasp the stakes, misunderstand her, attempt to dominate her, or misuse her knowledge. And the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for them individually, but for entire networks of commerce, entire communities, even the fragile social structures they believed unshakable. Her existence was a warning encoded in flesh and mind. Power is a weapon, knowledge is a weapon, and only those who approach both with respect, precision, and understanding can survive. The rest, those who acted impulsively out of fear, greed, or arrogance, would be you. And yet, the men could not stop themselves. They were compelled, as if some invisible force had pulled a lever deep in their psychology. Every dollar added to the price was a surrender, a tacit acknowledgement of her dominion. They were participants in their own subjugation, and they did not yet know it. By the time the gavel rose for the final fall, most in the room understood something fundamental. The auction was never about money. It was about testing comprehension, perception, and the ability to navigate forces deliberately concealed from ordinary eyes. The price they paid would be measured not in dollars, but in insight, obedience, and survival. In that moment, Charleston itself seemed to pause. History, carefully curated to obscure truth, held its breath, and the young woman, silent, composed, and terrifyingly aware, stood at the center of it all. She was not just a witness to human frailty, she was the arbiter of it. And those who thought themselves masters of their fate were discovering, one painful revelation at a time, that true mastery requires understanding the invisible systems, the hidden networks, and the centuries of manipulation that shape every aspect of human ambition. The auction was over in minutes, but its consequences would echo for decades, touching every life that came near her shadow. The gavel fell, and with it, the illusion of control shattered completely. The young woman had been purchased, yes, but not as a possession in the conventional sense. She had been claimed as a conduit, a vessel, a gatekeeper of knowledge deliberately withheld from society. The buyer, whether the rugged Western farmer or the shadowed stranger, understood that his role was not to dominate her, but to navigate the rules embedded within her being. Every step, every word, every interaction would be a test of insight and patience, designed to ensure that the secret T carried were revealed only to those capable of wielding them responsibly. As they departed Charleston, whispers followed them like shadows. Men in the auction house, men who had once considered themselves masters of commerce and human value, could not shake the feeling that they had glimpsed something far beyond their understanding. Some would fall into obsession, spending decades chasing fragments of what they had seen but could not possess. Others would encounter ruin, undone by the subtle mechanics of influence she had revealed simply through presence. The lesson was clear: knowledge, once concentrated, exerts a force far more compelling than wealth, status, or intimidation. The journey north into the mountains, away from the scrutiny of civilized society, was deliberate. Isolation was necessary. She could not be exposed to ordinary society, nor could her knowledge be accessed by those unprepared. Her new environment was a laboratory of control, a stage where the principles of influence, obedience, and comprehension would be tested in real time. The buyer was now a participant in a system centuries in the making, a human instrument subject to rules designed by invisible architects who understood power far more deeply than any conventional ruler. And the knowledge she possessed was no ordinary instruction. It contained insights into resource allocation, territorial advantage, agricultural optimization, and psychological leverage. It included methods that could elevate small communities into dominions or collapse entire plantations through subtle manipulations. Every element had been verified by sworn witnesses, documented and sealed to ensure the knowledge could not be coerced or stolen. It was a living testament to the idea that information, properly controlled, is the ultimate weapon, more potent than armies, more enduring than wealth, more decisive than law. For the buyer, the stakes were immediate and existential. Failure to follow her instructions precisely would render the knowledge inaccessible. Missteps could trigger resistance, erode trust, or even provoke psychological collapse, both in him and, potentially, in the networks he sought to influence. The transaction had been completed, but the real journey had only begun. The young woman on the mountain was not a servant, she was the architect of outcomes invisible to ordinary men. And in the silence of her presence the buyer understood something few ever comprehend: power is never seized. It is earned, deciphered, and maintained through mastery of systems most dare not even acknowledge. The first lesson began not with words, but with observation. The buyer quickly realized that the young woman was already reading him, measuring his patience, his reasoning, his impulses, before he even understood the structure of the test. She created conditions in which his mind became the instrument, responding to cues invisible to ordinary perception. Every question he posed, every attempt to assert authority, was met with calculated silence or subtle redirection. This was not defiance, it was precision. Every response she allowed, every gesture she withheld, served a purpose: to expose the weaknesses, the assumptions, and the latent fears that governed his decisions. He soon understood that extraction of her knowledge would not be a process of force or instruction. It would be a meticulous unfolding, a negotiation with systems embedded within her mind. The sealed letter contained the framework, yes, but the execution depended entirely on his ability to observe, internalize, and align with her rhythms. Misalignment would block the information entirely. Arrogance or impatience could trigger failure. And failure was not merely wasted effort, it could provoke resistance so profound that the knowledge would be locked away indefinitely, irretrievable by any method short of centuries of study. The psychological tests were subtle but relentless. She orchestrated scenarios in which he faced ethical dilemmas, decisions that measured greed against prudence, ambition against restraint. Each outcome generated feedback, not through conversation but through perception. Tiny gestures, shifts in posture, the way her eyes met his. The buyer came to understand that she was not only a repository of data, she was a living system of checks and balances, ensuring that those who claimed her knowledge could wield it responsibly. She revealed truths indirectly, allowing him to discover patterns, relationships, and insights, but never granting a shortcut. Only mastery of the process itself yielded the treasure concealed within her mind. The more he learned, the more he realized the enormity of the forces at play. Her knowledge was not merely agricultural or commercial, it encompassed human networks, social hierarchies, and the architecture of influence across entire regions. To access it was to participate in systems deliberately hidden from ordinary society, systems designed to manipulate outcomes with precision and subtlety. And she had been trained to defend, conceal, and deploy this intelligence, not as a servant but as a gatekeeper whose loyalty was bound to the principles of control, not the whims of any single man. The extraction was therefore as much about the buyer's transformation as it was about the knowledge itself. He began to sense the invisible threads that connected power, fear, and obedience, recognizing that the world he thought he controlled was only a facade. Every revelation carried weight, not just practical value but the responsibility to wield it wisely. And in those mountain sessions, the young woman remained the silent arbiter, her calm and unwavering presence. A constant reminder, the greatest truths in life are never taken. They are earned through discipline, perception, and the courage to confront forces most men never acknowledge. To understand her fully, one must look beyond the auction block, beyond the mountains, beyond the immediate transactions of wealth and ambition. She was not a product of happenstance. She was the culmination of deliberate, centuries-long design by networks that operate beyond the reach of ordinary history. These were institutions, societies, and clandestine alliances whose purpose was to shape, manipulate, and control the flow of knowledge, and through it, the very destiny of regions, economies, and empires. Plantation owners, merchants, legal authorities, they were visible instruments, pieces on a board whose strategy was hidden from sight. She existed to bridge the gap between visible power and invisible influence. Her creation was a lesson in systemic control. She embodied methods, secrets, and strategies carefully removed from public consciousness, deliberately obscured through law, religion, and commerce. Ordinary men were conditioned to ignore these forces, to accept the surface reality of the world while the architects of influence shaped outcomes from the shadows. And she was their repository, trained to resist coercion, capable of perceiving and decoding intent, and programmed to release her knowledge only to those capable of understanding its weight. She was not property, she was a principle, a living node of power. Every man in Charleston, every bidder at the auction became part of this hidden system, though none could see it. The frenzy of the auction, the moral panic, the irrational escalation of bids, they were not merely reactions to human curiosity or desire. They were manifestations of centuries of engineered human behavior, systems designed to identify weakness, manipulate ambition, and consolidate the flow of information. The auction house itself, the legal attestations, even the social expectations of 1857 Charleston, they were all components of a network constructed to protect what was truly dangerous, concentrated knowledge in human form, and make no mistake, this was deliberate. Institutions of power, from economic boards to social hierarchies, understood that the human mind is both a weapon and a container. Ordinary people cannot hold dangerous knowledge without destruction, either of themselves or their communities. She had been conditioned, perfected, and safeguarded to ensure that only a disciplined, perceptive, and morally calibrated individual could access her insights. Any attempt to bypass these protections would trigger resistance, misinterpretation, or catastrophic failure. The networks that created her had anticipated every conceivable misstep. Her existence also exposes a fundamental truth about human history. The stories we are told, the records we trust, and the hierarchies we accept are often designed to obscure deeper systems of control. She was a living exception, a reminder that knowledge is power, and that power, when hidden, is absolute. By standing before the auctioneer, the bidders, and the invisible forces that had orchestrated her life, she revealed a principle older than law, commerce, or even morality itself. The world is not governed by what we see, but by the structures we cannot see, and those who control them remain untouchable. Her knoll. Edge was not simply recorded or taught, it was encoded through ritual, observation, and discipline. Every movement she had learned, every interaction, every silence was part of a verification system. She had been conditioned to respond only to methods designed by those who understood the true architecture of power, gestures, timing, and cues that would appear meaningless to anyone uninitiated. Ordinary questioning would yield nothing. Force would provoke resistance. Only precise alignment with her protocols, an understanding of rhythm, ethics, and observation, would unlock the truths she carried. In essence, she was a human lock, and the key was invisible, perceptible only to those trained in its logic. The verification methods themselves were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. A single glance could indicate comprehension. A hesitation, a micro-expression, a shift in stance could reveal misunderstanding or arrogance. These were not tricks or theatrics. They were calibrated signals, part of a sophisticated system that measured alignment with centuries of accumulated knowledge and unspoken rules. And these rules were intentionally hidden from society, preserved within a human vessel, guarded by training so precise that even the most sophisticated attempts at brute force could never succeed. She was the archive, the auditor, and the arbiter of hidden truth all at once. Her conditioning went beyond intellect or memorization. It involved emotional and psychological calibration, the ability to maintain composure, discern intent, and resist manipulation. Years of rigorous training had honed her ability to observe the subtle patterns of human behavior, detect duplicity, and evaluate the worthiness of those who sought access to her knowledge. She could sense fear, ambition, and ego before they manifested, using these observations to control interactions without a sin. Deal word. Every movement, every silence, every gesture was a test of alignment with the invisible forces that had created her. The consequences of failure were severe. Those who approached her unprepared, without discipline, or with intentions tainted by greed, would find themselves blocked from the knowledge entirely. The systems she embodied were fail-safes designed to protect secrets of extraordinary value, and these were not merely academic or technical insights. They encompassed strategies for commerce, influence, and social control capable of reshaping communities and fortunes. Her knowledge was dangerous precisely because it could be misused, misinterpreted, or mishandled by men who thought themselves competent. In this way, she was both protector and weapon. She safeguarded centuries of accumulated secrets and ensured that only those capable of understanding and respecting them could gain access. Every interaction, every gesture, every carefully measured silence reinforced the principle that power is not inherited, purchased, or forced. It is earned through comprehension, discipline, and alignment with forces most men never perceive. And those who failed, even by a fraction, would learn the lesson slowly, painfully, and irrevocably. The first revelations were subtle, nothing like the sudden explosion of knowledge one might imagine. Instead, they arrived as patterns, relationships, and insights woven into everyday observation. She would ask questions without speaking, direct attention without gesture, and the buyer gradually began to see what had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Land that seemed ordinary now revealed subtle advantages. Trade routes carried implications far beyond profit margins. Social alliances concealed leverage that had shaped the region for generations. He realized, almost too late, that he was no longer merely learning facts. He was absorbing a framework for understanding influence itself. Each insight carried weight, not only intellectual but moral and psychological. He began to sense the full responsibility of what it meant to possess her knowledge. Misapplied, it could destroy fortunes, ruin families, destabilize communities. He could manipulate people unknowingly, sway decisions, or disrupt the delicate balance of power that had been carefully maintained for generations. And this realization was the first true test. Could he internalize power without succumbing to its seductive corruption? Could he comprehend the magnitude of his role without attempting to dominate or exploit recklessly? The process of revelation itself was a trial. Knowledge was never handed over in full. She created situations, posed silent dilemmas, and watched him interpret patterns. Small mistakes were amplified, forcing him to reflect, adjust, and refine his understanding. Over time, he discovered that the value lay not merely in the information itself, but in the discipline required to extract it. His mind, once linear and transactional, was being reshaped, forced to operate within the architecture of influence she carried. The insights became a mirror, reflecting both his competence and his limitations. He also began to notice the invisible connections linking her knowledge to the broader world. Commerce, politics, agriculture, and human behavior were not isolated systems. They were interwoven, each influencing the other in ways so subtle that only a trained observer could detect them. And she had been trained to perceive every nuance. Every observation she allowed him to make was a lesson in systems thinking, in control, in the manipulation of outcomes, without ever appearing to intervene directly. The buyer realized he was being initiated, subtly but irrevocably, into a reality that most men would never even suspect. By the end of these early sessions, the transformation had begun. He was no longer just a purchaser, no longer just a man seeking advantage. He was becoming a participant in a hidden network, a player in systems older than the auction, older than the city, older than the plantation economy itself. And all the while, she remained silent, calm, and exacting, a constant reminder that true power is never given. It is earned through comprehension, discipline, and the courage to confront forces most men refuse to acknowledge. As the buyer began to apply what he learned, the scope of her knowledge became terrifyingly clear. He saw patterns in society that had always existed, but were invisible to the untrained eye, who truly controlled the flow of wealth, who dictated social norms, and who leveraged fear to manipulate obedience. These networks were not just economic. They were moral, psychological, and political. Corruption was embedded at every level, from local officials to regional elites, and her understanding of these systems was precise, surgical, and unassailable. What had been invisible was now painfully clear. He realized that ordinary society was a carefully constructed illusion, maintained not by consensus or morality, but by those who understood human nature deeply. Law, tradition, and religion were tools to guide behavior, but behind them were invisible levers, subtle nudges, and deliberate omissions designed to maintain hierarchy and control. The young woman had been trained to see these systems as a living map. Every person, every institution, every decision could be traced through hidden channels of influence. Knowledge was concentrated, power was hidden, and the majority of people had no idea they were being guided by unseen hands. The moral weight of this realization was immense. Possessing her knowledge meant seeing through centuries of manipulation and understanding that human freedom was often a carefully curated illusion. Those who believed themselves independent were not. They were actors within scripts designed by generations of invisible strategists. The buyer felt both exhilaration and dread. To hold such understanding was intoxicating, yet it carried the danger of arrogance and miscalculation. Misapplied, the knowledge could destabilize communities, destroy fortunes, and unleash chaos. And yet, properly applied, it could shift the balance of power quietly, decisively, and irreversibly. This was why her training included psychological calibration. She did not merely impart facts, she conditioned those who sought her insights to perceive the subtle mechanics of manipulation, to understand influence as a living system. He learned to see deception, anticipate moves, and predict outcomes. Every interaction became a test. Could he act with the discipline, patience, and ethical restraint required to wield knowledge safely? The stakes were existential. The secrets she carried were not just powerful, they were dangerous in the hands of the unprepared. By the end of these sessions, the buyer understood a critical truth. History is not what is written in books. History is what is preserved, concealed, and orchestrated by those who control the flow of information. And the young woman was a living testament to that reality, a guardian of secrets that had shaped entire societies without ever appearing in public record. The more he learned, the more he realized that power, true power, is invisible, and it has always been guarded by systems most men never notice until it is too late. The deeper he delved, the heavier the burden became. Knowledge of this magnitude is not neutral. It shapes perception, alters priorities, and distorts reality for those who dare to possess it. The buyer began to see the world differently. Alliances that once seemed casual revealed subtle manipulations. Markets were not neutral but orchestrated, and every act of governance carried invisible strings pulling outcomes behind the curtain. It was intoxicating, yes, but also corrosive. The more he understood, the less ordinary life seemed real. Friends, neighbors, even family. Each became potential vectors of ignorance, pawns in games whose rules only he now partially grasped. The psychological toll was relentless. To see invisible systems and remain patient, disciplined, and precise requires extraordinary restraint. Every mistake risked eroding the integrity of the knowledge itself. One misapplied insight could unravel months of careful observation, misalign influence, or provoke resistance from those trained to protect it. He began to feel the subtle pressure of centuries pressing down, the collective weight of generations of human design, all encoded in the young woman before him. And in that silence he understood something terrifying. Power is not merely an advantage. It is a responsibility that punishes error mercilessly. Morality, too, became a complex terrain. The knowledge allowed him to manipulate outcomes with surgical precision, to redirect resources, influence decisions, and sway individuals without their awareness. But every decision carried consequences beyond comprehension. To act selfishly risked collapse. To act negligently risked catastrophe. The lessons embedded in her conditioning were clear. Understanding alone is not sufficient. One must wield insight ethically, consciously, and with unwavering attention to the invisible architecture of systems. Failure is not theoretical, it is existential. The world, outside the mountain, remained oblivious to these forces. Ordinary men continued their lives, believing they were in control of their fortunes, their reputations, and their cities. Meanwhile, the buyer now operated on a different plane, aware of the forces that shape history and human behavior, aware of the networks that influence life without leaving visible traces. He could no longer participate in society as a naive actor. He was irrevocably altered. He had become, in effect, a participant in a game whose rules were older and more powerful than he had ever imagined, a world in which ordinary morality and ambition were insufficient. And through it all, the young woman remained the quiet arbiter. She observed, measured, and revealed only what he could responsibly handle. She was not a servant or a tool. She was the gatekeeper, the guardian of forbidden truths. The cost of this knowledge was clarity, discipline, and perpetual vigilance. The reward, however, was a perspective and power that few men had ever glimpsed. To see the hidden currents of human influence is to live with a perpetual awareness of both possibility and danger, a duality that shapes not just decisions, but the very essence of who a man becomes when confronted with truths too powerful to ignore. It was at this point that the buyer began to recognize a profound truth. Knowledge is not just information, it is a force that transforms the very structure of a person. He realized that understanding the hidden currents of influence, the invisible systems of control, and the meticulous conditioning embedded in the young woman required more than intellect. It demanded a complete recalibration of perception, a surrender to discipline, and an embrace of responsibility most men could not conceive. This was no longer about acquiring power, it was about becoming a vessel capable of wielding it without destruction. And here, the story turns to you, the observer. There is a reason you have followed this descent into forbidden truths. You are standing at the threshold, the halfway point where understanding begins to demand action. To recognize your own alignment with hidden forces, to acknowledge the invisible systems that shape every choice, every desire, every impulse. You must mark it. Comment below with the phrase, "I see the currents." Type it twice. Commit it to the world and, more importantly, to yourself. This is not ritual for entertainment. It is the first symbolic step in recognizing the systems that govern life beyond perception. A signal that you are ready to awaken, to observe, and to integrate truths most will never confront. The buyer, under her silent guidance, had already begun this process. Every interaction became a mirror, reflecting strengths, weaknesses, impulses, and fears. The discipline he developed in these sessions was a gateway, a filter, and a safeguard. Without it, the knowledge would have remained inaccessible, or worse, destructive. And you, sitting on the edge of revelation, face the same choice. Will you engage deliberately, acknowledging both the risk and responsibility of awareness? Or will you drift through life blind to the architecture of power that shapes your decisions and desires? The moment you commit to recognizing the currents, you align yourself with a principle older than civilization itself. Awareness is power, and power without perception is chaos. The transformation is subtle at first. Awareness sharpens perception. Observation reveals patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. Systems of manipulation, control, and influence that were once hidden become visible. You begin to understand why people act as they do, why institutions operate as they do, and how histories are constructed to conceal what is most dangerous. The buyer experienced this in a compressed, intense reality. For you, it is a gradual awakening, a deepening of insight into forces that shape your life even when you are unaware. And through it all, the young woman remains the silent guide. She is calm, composed, and deliberate, a constant reminder that true knowledge is neither chaotic nor indiscriminate. It is selective, disciplined, and profoundly dangerous in the wrong hands. The buyer's journey mirrors the potential journey for anyone willing to step beyond ordinary perception. To awaken is not optional. It is inevitable for those who confront the truth. Comment your phrase, acknowledge the currents, and feel the first tremor of transformation. Once recognized, there is no turning back. The buyer soon realized that the knowledge he was gaining did more than inform. It transformed. Every observation, every insight, every carefully guided lesson reshaped his perception of reality. Ordinary men live constrained by the limits of what they can see, measure, or predict. He now operated on a plane beyond those limitations. He saw the invisible architecture of influence woven into trade, politics, and society itself. He saw cause and effect before they unfolded. He understood leverage, fear, ambition, and loyalty in ways that could bend outcomes with quiet precision. It was intoxicating, and it was dangerous. The risk of misuse became immediately apparent. Knowledge without discipline is a weapon that inevitably turns inward. One misapplied principle could destroy fortunes, devastate communities, or unravel the fragile networks that maintain stability. The buyer understood that insight carried consequences not measured in money or status, but in human lives. Every choice was amplified. Every action, deliberate or instinctive, interacted with invisible forces he could now perceive. Ordinary ambition, unchecked, became catastrophic. Even well-intentioned decisions could ripple outward in ways impossible to control without mastery. And yet, the temptation was irresistible. To know the unseen currents is to feel power coursing through every decision, every relationship, every market. Men who lack the discipline to integrate such knowledge are seduced, becoming tyrants of perception before they realize the weight of their actions. The buyer's challenge was not rely to acquire information. It was to integrate it into himself, to become a vessel capable of wielding truth without succumbing to ego, fear, or greed. And this is precisely why she, the young woman, exists as both guardian and teacher. She does not merely contain knowledge, she tests, calibrates, and ensures that only those capable of ethical comprehension gain access. The tension between insight and ambition is the crucible of power. Many men, when faced with glimpses of invisible systems, attempt to dominate rather than observe, to seize rather than earn. They fail. The buyer, under her silent guidance, was learning to navigate the paradox. Power demands understanding, yet understanding tempts misuse. It is a delicate equilibrium, maintained only through vigilance, patience, and discipline. One misstep, one lapse of humility, and the knowledge becomes a curse rather than an advantage, unraveling the wielder faster than any external force could. This is the lesson she imparts in silence. Mastery is not in acquisition, but in alignment. To possess knowledge is to understand responsibility, consequence, and restraint. The buyer's mind, reshaped through her tests, began to internalize these truths. He was no longer the same man who had walked into Charleston that morning. Each revelation, each subtle nudge, had stripped away naivety and ego, leaving a perception sharpened to the edge of danger and power. And through it all, she remained still, a living testament that control over knowledge, and control over self, is the most formidable force in existence. The buyer came to understand that her knowledge was not isolated. It was a key to systems spanning generations, cities, and even continents. What he learned in those mountain sessions revealed patterns invisible to ordinary society, how wealth is preserved, how influence is consolidated, and how human behavior is guided by subtle, nearly imperceptible pressures. Institutions that appeared neutral, churches, courts, trade organizations, were in reality components of a carefully orchestrated web. Every decision, every regulation, every market shift was shaped by forces hidden in plain sight. She was the vessel that allowed access to this hidden architecture, and to grasp it was to perceive the mechanisms that govern entire societies. The consequences were profound. Elites, who once assumed their power derived from inheritance, status, or brute force, were revealed as participants in a far older, more precise network of control. Their influence depended not on their talent or ambition alone, but on systems they could neither fully see nor manipulate without risk. The knowledge she carried exposed vulnerabilities in these networks and demonstrated the leverage that a single individual could gain if they understood the invisible rules, and this awareness, once grasped, could be transformative or catastrophic, depending on the wielder's discipline. Her existence also revealed the fragility of ordinary perception. Most people move through life blind to the levers that shape behavior, their ambitions and fears guided by forces they cannot name. Those who attempt to intervene without comprehension are doomed to failure, humiliation, or ruin, and those who succeed must integrate awareness, patience, and ethical calibration, or risk becoming instruments of chaos. In essence, she was a living calibration tool for human systems, a filter that ensured only those capable of navigating the hidden rules could act without collapsing the delicate equilibrium of influence. Every revelation carried weight. The buyer understood not just markets or alliances, but the moral dimension of concealed power. To apply knowledge without restraint was to risk disaster. To withhold it entirely risked stagnation and failure. Her role, and the systems that created her, were designed to protect these truths, to prevent them from falling into unworthy hands. And in observing her, he realized that the line between mastery and destruction is thinner than most men dare to acknowledge. One miscalculation, one act of arrogance, and the ripple effects could destabilize wealth, governance, and human behavior itself. Ultimately, she was not just a repository of secrets. She was a mirror of civilization's hidden mechanics, a testament to the invisible forces shaping history, and a living reminder that knowledge is the most formidable currency in existence. Those who grasp it are transformed, forever aware of the currents beneath the surface, forever responsible for the consequences of their actions. And those who fail are punished silently, their ignorance exploited by systems they never even suspected existed. In her presence, the buyer and, by extension, any observer, cannot escape the reality. Control is precise, knowledge is power, and the world is always governed by forces unseen. The danger of her knowledge is absolute. To possess it without the discipline to wield it responsibly is to invite destruction. Men who attempt to bend it to their own vanity, greed, or ego are quickly undone, often without understanding why. The buyer witnessed this firsthand, not only in the theory she taught, but in subtle warnings encoded in her presence. Every hesitation, every misstep, every lapse of judgment was magnified, echoing consequences that could ripple outward, destroying influence, fortune, and even sanity. Knowledge in her hands is a crucible, testing not just skill but character. There is a psychological cost unlike any other. Awareness of hidden systems reshapes perception irreversibly. The buyer began to see patterns where once he saw chaos, to predict outcomes where once he guessed blindly, and to understand manipulation where once he assumed innocence. Relationships became exercises in strategy. Society itself became a web of calculated moves and unseen pressures. The mind that absorbs such truth can no longer participate in ordinary life without tension, without the constant awareness that everything is subtly influenced by invisible hands. The world becomes both clearer and infinitely more dangerous. Misused power does more than harm others. It erodes the user. Those who grasp the currents but act impulsively, or without respect for the architecture she embodies, find their judgment clouded, their decisions corrupted, and their ambitions turning inward as they destroy the very systems they hope to control. Entire enterprises can collapse. Alliances fracture and reputations disintegrate, all under the weight of knowledge that was never meant to be wielded casually. The cost is absolute. Power without discipline punishes brutally, silently, and permanently. For the buyer, the transformation was unavoidable. He was no longer the man who walked into Charleston that March morning. Each lesson, each observation, each subtle revelation had reshaped him, aligning him with forces he had never imagined. His understanding of influence, of social architecture, of human behavior was profound, but so was the responsibility. To navigate this knowledge without corruption required constant vigilance, discipline, and humility. There was no turning back. Once the hidden currents are seen, once the invisible levers of control are recognized, a man cannot unsee, cannot unknow, and cannot resume ignorance without danger. She remained the silent arbiter, the guardian of forbidden truths. Her presence was a reminder: knowledge is not granted lightly, and power is not exercised without consequence. The buyer, and anyone who dares follow this path, must accept that the world is not as it appears, that control is subtle, and that mastery is never free. The transformation is total, the responsibility permanent, and the consequences unforgiving. To confront these truths is to step beyond ordinary life, to see the invisible threads that shape every choice, and to carry the weight of knowledge that most men cannot even imagine. And now, we arrive at the final truth, the one that cannot be ignored. The young woman on that auction block, the knowledge she carried, the invisible forces shaping every moment, all point to a principle older than law, wealth, or morality. Power is unseen, and the world bends not to those who believe they control it, but to those who understand the hidden systems that govern it. To witness this, to perceive it, is to be changed forever. The buyer was transformed. The auction house shattered expectations, and every observer forced into a reckoning with reality itself. There is no return to ordinary perception once you have glimpsed the machinery behind society. She remains, in history and legend, a reminder of what it means to wield knowledge responsibly. Her silence, her discipline, her ability to perceive and guard truth are not anomalies. They are the architecture, power that has always existed, concealed from public view. Ordinary people are taught obedience, submission, or distraction. The select few, trained or initiated, are permitted insight, and those who are unprepared, who approach with arrogance, greed, or ignorance, are exposed, tested, and inevitably corrected by forces they cannot see. The lesson is stark: awareness is power, but power is responsibility. For you, the viewer, this is not a story to be consumed lightly. You have followed the descent into forbidden knowledge, you have witnessed the architecture of control, and you have been asked to confront invisible currents that shape human ambition and history. The choice now is yours. Will you integrate these lessons, becoming a man capable of perceiving and navigating unseen systems? Will you recognize the subtle manipulations that guide every market, every social hierarchy, every decision you make? Or will you turn away, comforted by ignorance, and remain bound by forces you cannot name? The path forward is deliberate, disciplined, and irreversible. The transformation begins with recognition and action. You have been asked to declare your alignment, to acknowledge the currents, to mark your understanding. That declaration is a threshold, a signal that you are awake to the structures that govern reality. From this point, every decision you make, every observation, every interaction can be measured against the invisible levers that shape human behavior. To confront them is to accept responsibility, not just for yourself, but for the consequences of knowledge. And so she remains silent, vigilant, eternal. The young woman on the auction block, the vessel of forbidden truths, and the ultimate arbiter of perception. She is a mirror of power, a test of character, and a reminder that the deepest secrets of history, society, and human ambition are never neutral. Once seen, they cannot be unseen. Once understood, they demand mastery. Once confronted, they change a man forever. And now, having walked through her story, having glimpsed the hidden currents, you carry that same responsibility. There is no return, only awareness, discipline, and the vigilance required to navigate the world as it truly is.